What is going on, everybody? I hope you're having a great day today. This is Alex from the Fresh Fantasy Podcast, and this is the 41st episode of Season 2. Today, we're going to be talking about fantasy football injuries for the final time before the season, talking about Saquon's ACL, DeAndre Swift's groin, Michael Thomas's ankle, and so many more. Joining me to break this all down today, because I am not qualified, is a man who is a board-certified orthopedic clinical specialist and physical therapist, but more importantly for your fantasy ears, he is the lead writer, injury expert, and DFS analyst for the Fantasy Footballers with over 13.8 thousand followers on Twitter. He is Matthew Betts. Welcome back to the show, Matt.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. It's good to be back on. And you and I were talking before we hit record, like to get back on the show twice, it feels awesome. Like, we're back here. We talked about all these guys, 2 months ago, it feels like probably at this point. So a lot has changed and I'm excited to break it down.
For sure. And I think I'm excited to break it down because there's definitely some things that, I'm worried about here for my fantasy teams, mainly DeAndre Swift. We'll get into that one pretty early. But I'm really excited to break these all down because, again, we all still have drafts coming up. We're about a week or so before the season. So this is the most critical time to get someone like this on because, you have your full-time career, but for us fantasy football managers, getting to hear about stuff like this is, reading whatever religion or whatever you want to hear that we're preaching and stuff like that. And this is the best kind of stuff that you can listen to for fantasy football, especially when you're really trying to figure out what guys are going to stay healthy. Because I could draft the best player in the world, but if he's an insanely big injury risk, then he's not going to really help me for the full season. So that's what we have you here for today. And with that said, I don't know about best player in the world, but I think one of the best talents in the world is to know whether to start off with. That's Saquon Barkley. Obviously, everyone's talked about it, heard about it, speculated about it, but we're looking a little better than we were last time I had you on with this ACL, but that is just my perspective. So how are you feeling about Saquon Barkley's ACL? Do you think that there's a solid chance at this point that he's going to play week one? And how do you expect his early season performance to be hampered at all from this injury?
Yeah, so with Saquon, really everything has gone to plan to this point. He's progressed extremely well over the course of the summer. His strength routine has looked awesome. Clearly, he's back into practice. He started with what we like to see, right? Some individual drills, back into some 7-on-7 work, then to 11-on-11, practice, and then kind of from there, increasing reps, frequency, and intensity with what he's doing. Now, of course, we didn't get to see him in game action in the preseason. I don't think anyone should be worried about that. That was never part of the plan for the Giants. Of course, the risk there, not really worth it for a player who is your future, basically, at running back and took him second overall just a few years ago. So that all makes sense. So he is progressing well. He's doing what he should be right now. The only issue is not much has changed in terms of his early season outlook, for me anyway. And the reason I say that is because all along, even back in May, June, like it was easy to see a scenario where Saquon Barkley is quote unquote ready for week one, meaning he is active, he is in pads, he's in uniform on the field. But are you going to get the same Saquon Barkley you're getting in week one that you're going to get in week 10? And I think we can very confidently say the answer to that question is no. The reason for that is just that, when you have the injury that he had with a delayed surgery because of the fact that, he had multiple structures injured. When you have your meniscus repaired, it takes longer to be able to do everything you want to do in terms of your ACL recovery, as far as jumping, cutting, running, all those things. And it just pushes the timeline back for a player to be at 100%. So for me, when I approach Saquon Barkley, I am taking him when he falls to a point where it's comfortable. I'm not the type of person right now that logs in and says, all right, here's Saquon Barkley staring me at the face with the 4th overall pick. Here we go, where you would do that a year or two ago, right? For me, that's not it this year. And I can see other people making the argument because he is a talent. But for me, just knowing that it might be a little bit of a slower start, I think I'm out at his current ADP.
I guess two small questions for you with that being said. You said you wouldn't take him at 4th overall. I obviously wouldn't either. But would you take him in the first round? And I'd say 12-team league. What's the earliest that you have taken him or be willing to take him? But the other question with that is I just have to ask, I guess, for the managers like me and stuff like that you hear these arguments on Twitter that get you a little excited. Like Adrian Peterson, 8 or 9 years ago, he tore his ACL and then he came out and led the league in rushing. And I don't know if that was the year he won MVP or the year after. But again, he was able to do that. So that gets people excited and people are comparing it to Saquon because they're a similar talent, but obviously that doesn't mean much for the recovery. So do you think that legitimately he could do what Adrian Peterson did and lead the league in rushing coming off of this? And I guess the other question is, how early are you willing to take him in a 12-team league?
Yeah, I'll go with your second question first. Where am I willing to draft him? And right now, I've done, I think, 4 season-long drafts so far. I've gotten him in 0, and it's always because someone else takes him before I do.
Yeah.
He's been going in like the back end of round 1. I'm not taking him there. I prefer an elite wide receiver or Travis Kelce over him. It's just safer, and you can't risk your first round pick not working out. The
Yeah.
hit rate in terms of winning your league is just not good when that happens. And so I'm taking him when he falls to early round 2 for sure. I've gotten him in a bunch of best ball drafts at that point. Sometimes he falls to like the middle of the second round, and that feels like, okay, I'll take that risk. So that's where I'm willing to go in on Saquon Barkley. Then to answer your first question in terms of, can he lead the league in rushing? Can he have an Adrian Peterson-esque season after this ACL injury? It's a 1% chance to me. I don't see a scenario where it happens, not even really because of the ACL. Like, that is a factor, but we cannot put into words how horrific this Giants offense projects to be.
Yeah.
Like, he may get all the touches in the world, and that's great, but let's not forget, like, Daniel Jones has major warts. Like, Jason Garrett, the OC, has major warts. This offensive line is ranked dead last according to PFF. Like, there are serious issues here. And we also need to remind ourselves, like, Saquon Barkley, who he was as a rookie, we have never seen that from Saquon Barkley again. And it's because he was playing with Eli Manning, who was very willing to check the ball down to him over and over again, which we love in PPR. Not that Daniel Jones won't or can't do that, but we just haven't seen it. And so people are knocking Saquon because of his injury. We should be really evaluating this Giants ecosystem and being very concerned about it. And that for me is enough to be like, I don't see an Adrian Peterson type season for him. I hope I'm wrong. Like, I love Saquon. I'm a Penn State fan, so hopefully I'm wrong, but I just can't see it.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I think people forget the fact that, like, his first season as a rookie, he had over 100 targets, in a season. The exact number is 121, and to go from that down to 73, which is only about 5 a game, which is a lot less. I know 5 a game is friggin' awesome, but like you get what I'm saying, that for that kind of upside. And I think when you add Kenny Golladay, you add Kadarius Toney, who I don't like as a prospect, but again, you still drafted him in the first round, which means he's going to get on the field. He's coming off an ACL, so they might be hesitant to give him that full workload right away. So I think for that reason, I'm fading. I did pick up Saquon in my first out of like 10 redraft leagues the other day, because I got him in the early second round, around pick 13, I think, of a 10-team league, because I was just like, I keep hearing all these like Adrian Peterson narrative arguments, and I was like, for that reason, I just have to get him somewhere. So if he just like lights the world on fire, which it doesn't sound like he will, I'll at least have one share, so I don't feel that bad about myself. But definitely
that's
away from.
Yeah, that's the range to take him too. So I'm with you.
Yep, exactly. Another guy, sticking with the topic of ACLs, we actually have one for each position today besides tight end. Is Joe Burrow. Obviously, we've heard a lot of different things in camp, but one day his knee is terrible and he doesn't trust it. The next day he's looking fine. He even got out there for, I think it was 4 snaps in the preseason game on week 4, which, bodes well for him. So I think it's pretty fair to say, from what things sound like at this point, if he's getting out there, that he's probably going to play week 1. And please correct me if I'm wrong. But I guess more what I'd like to ask is, with that would probably be my first question is, let's say he gets in week 1. How soon should it be coming off this injury, and where the timeline is? Because he got hurt like 8 weeks or 9 weeks after Saquon, but he plays a different position. So like, when is he going to get back to 100% during the season? And does that injury, is it going to affect his performance? And I just threw a lot at you.
Yeah, this Joe Burrow situation is really interesting, because we got early confirmation. Like the first week of training camp, they were like, Joe Burrow is cleared for everything. 11 on 11. If the team wanted to play him in preseason, they could have. Obviously, they chose not to. There was no medical restriction at that point. So that means green light from a rehab perspective. It does not necessarily mean green light from a psychological readiness for sport for an athlete. And this is what happens. We see this all the time. Like just 2 weeks ago, everyone was freaking out about Courtland Sutton when there was comments of, I'm not really sure where my knee's at, or, I don't necessarily feel as confident yet. Like, and that's all normal. But to casual people that hear that, they think, well, Adrian Peterson won an MVP after his ACL tear. You should also be 100% right away. And it just doesn't work like that for most people. So these athletes, like, they need time and they need reps, they need practice, they need to get hit, they need to have little things happen where they're like, oh yeah, my knee's fine, I'm good to go, to build that confidence. And so, yeah, from a medical perspective, he will play. He will certainly start. I have zero concerns about that. But to answer your question, as far as like, what is he early in the season versus how will he progress? And it's kind of the same as Saquon. Like, more time that goes by, he will feel way more confident in his knee and likely perform better too, especially given that, he's still kind of getting back into maybe building chemistry that he had with Jamar Chase at LSU, obviously more reps with his other guys in T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd. And so, yeah, I think early on it could be a little rough for the Bengals offense. I do feel optimistic that at some point in the year, things will probably get going in the right direction, and we'll see, Joe Burrow be prolific for his pass catchers, but it will take time to get there.
Yeah. So just objectively, before the injury and stuff like that, where you'd be having Joe Burrow in your ranking, so to speak, would you be fading him slightly if you don't expect him to be full go right away? Like not a lot. You're not saying don't ever draft Joe Burrow. I know no one's saying that. But would you be saying, okay, I might fade him just a little bit more than you would think because of this injury, where QB 13, where he's going right now, might just be a little too high? Are you saying I'm going to bet on the talent and stuff like that, and I think he'll figure it out soon enough?
Yeah, for me, it's one of those things that I'm not really drafting Joe Burrow, especially if we're talking about like your standard one quarterback league.
Exactly.
There was a time about a month ago where he was like the quarterback 10 off the board, quarterback 9, and I never was willing to really do that. He was going ahead of guys like Tom Brady, who I would take 10 out of 10 times on a better offense with better weapons. And so the hype kind of got out of control. And so in that situation, it was, I'm not taking Joe Burrow, but now he's kind of falling to like that quarterback 13 to 15 ish range. And I have him at 15. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yep.
Now in a 12 team league, are you really reaching for Joe Burrow? Not necessarily. I think if someone else takes him and they do get off to a slow start, you may see him on your waiver wire. So I'm not really drafting him unless it's a 2 quarterback league at this point.
Okay, that's good to know. Sticking with the theme of ACLs, we're going on to wide receivers. I didn't put him on the show sheet, but if we could lump Courtland Sutton in there together with Odell Beckham. Odell Beckham is the player. But for both of those guys, mainly Odell Beckham is the guy that I'm really interested in because, again, for people that don't know, everyone knows in this show that I'm a huge fan of Matt Harmon's perception. Everybody knows Matt Harmon charting how well receivers get open. I mean, Odell Beckham was 11th in the entire NFL last year in beating man coverage. He looked explosive. He looked good. I know the production wasn't there, but again, this is still a guy that in his 2 seasons in Cleveland so far, he's had the 24% plus target share. I mean, again, the talent is there. So I guess I'm asking you is, with the time that he's had to recover and how wide receivers, I know it's different than quarterback and running back, how well they recover and the different types of muscles and movements that they use is different. How well do you expect his performance to be, or do you expect it to be hampered at all early in the season?
Yeah, by all accounts, he's looked great in camp. And he's another player that we unfortunately didn't get to see in preseason, but by all accounts, he's doing really well and he's progressing as he's supposed to. And again, he's a player that will enter week 1 without any medical restriction. So he should be good to go as far as the season's starting. The tricky part with him is like in his time with the Browns, we just have never seen the same Odell Beckham that we know. Yep. And so he's a player that I like at cost because the fact that last year and the year before, like he's a guy that you were taking to be like a mid-range wide receiver too. Some people were still like, this is Odell Beckham, like he's going to be the dude. But now expectations are very low. They're tempered at least, right? Like if you could take Odell Beckham as your wide receiver 3, I'm thrilled with that because I want to bet on a talented player who we know. I think a very underrated quarterback in Baker Mayfield and an offense that we know is going to score a ton of touchdowns. They lived in the red zone last year with Stefanski, and now you get the second year with Baker in that scheme. I like the Browns a lot this year. They've got, I think, the 8th highest implied total according to Vegas on a weekly basis as far as their average. So Vegas projects them to score a lot of points, and I want to attach myself to those teams. So, yeah, I think Odell Beckham as like a wide receiver 3 in your league is rock solid.
I like that. Love to hear. Is Courtland Sutton, I mean, I'm not for exactly the price, but do you expect him? I mean, we've gotten more mixed reports than Odell Beckham about Courtland Sutton, about good days and bad days and stuff like that we haven't seen with Odell Beckham. So is Courtland Sutton a guy that you're a little bit more concerned about from an injury perspective of how well he's going to be able to perform coming off the knee surgery?
He's a similar guy to, I would say, like Joe Burrow's outlook as far as like psychological type of situation. A couple of weeks ago, it was, oh my gosh, like everyone hit the panic button. And then there was a clip of him roasting a cornerback just this past weekend in the 3rd week of preseason. And he plants hard on his left knee, which is the ACL knee, and looked great. And so sometimes for an athlete, like when that happens, things just click. And then from there, it's fine kind of thing. So I do think that there's, again, some growing pains maybe early on. He hasn't had much time to build rapport with Teddy Bridgewater, of course. Like they just named him the quarterback. So there are some things to kind of think about in that perspective. And as well, they kind of just seem like an old school football team with Vic Fangio. Like they probably just want to like run the ball with Melvin Gordon, Javonte Williams, and play good defense. So it's all about expectations. Again, he's that kind of wide receiver 3 category for me with Courtland Sutton. He's fine where he is. I'm not reaching to try to get him.
Okay, that's good to know. I'll keep that in mind. And again, Courtland Sutton, not a guy that I'm reaching for much. I'd rather take Odell Beckham because, again, after the wide receiver 25 or 26, there's only really 2 receivers that have legitimate top 5 upside in that range, and that's Odell Beckham and Antonio Brown. And Odell Beckham, I don't think needs an injury in that offense to be able to do it. I think he could legitimately do it. I'm not saying, people, that I have Odell Beckham ranked in my top 15 wide receivers or anything like that. But when you're talking about range of outcomes, I think he's someone that absolutely does meet that. Another person that we talked about on the podcast a couple months ago, but now he's got a new injury, which I shouldn't be smiling as I'm saying that because that's not funny, is Dak Prescott. I mean, we talked earlier about the leg, and you were pretty confident that he'd be able to return full force, and we've seen leg-wise full force. But, when one thing breaks down, maybe other things have to break down sometimes. And unfortunately, he has a shoulder injury now. The reports have said that he's good. I mean, again, early on in that injury, they said that, okay, he could play week 1 already. And then Adam Schefter's like, who knows if he's going to be fully healthy all season. And I know it's a minor thing, and he's been throwing, and there's a lot of different reports out there, a lot of different information to consume about Dak Prescott. But what is your confidence level that Dak Prescott will be like healthy early in the season and be the same Dak that we're used to, at least arm talent wise?
Yeah, for Dak, I think his early season outlook is starting to look better and better as the days go by. And the reason I say that is because, 2 weeks ago, you couldn't really confidently say that. And the reason is, just like any other muscle strain, which he had a lat strain in his right shoulder, people hear these like hamstring injuries. They're like, well, he might play, but it's risky. And that's because these guys are trying to get back on the field so soon after the injury happens. And so the same is true for a muscle strain in your shoulder. Initially, you need to be really smart about how you manage reps, but not just shut it down and do nothing. You kind of have to build it back up slowly. So it was kind of impossible to tell you that answer to this question 2 weeks ago when he was still slowly ramping up, because at times the player progresses well. There's no hiccups. It's totally fine. Other times you progress and then all of a sudden it's like, now it's sore. We need to back off a little bit. And so it can be a little touch and go, but by all accounts, things look great for Dak. He's followed the protocol pretty well. I saw a report from The Athletic about a week ago saying that he had started to throw on back-to-back days, which for a throwing athlete, you really like to see, instead of them being very measured and saying, okay, you can throw on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, no more sort of situation. Now they're building more volume. And so I do think that as each day goes by, our confidence in Dak should increase. And so I do think that he's a player that I'm willing to take at ADP. I had a draft last night. He fell the 6th round. I took him. I had a CeeDee Lamb stack going. So I was like, you know what? This makes sense. So I like Dak. I think his early season outlook is strong. I still am hesitant that he's going to be that runner of the football early in the season that we've become accustomed to. Not that he's a Lamar Jackson type player, but he does scramble well and he can get outside the pocket. But I don't know if we'll see that type of player. But as far as his shoulder, I do think each day that goes by, our confidence should increase.
Okay, I think love to hear that, especially this year when there's a big 5, quarterbacks with Mahomes, Allen, Kyler, Lamar Jackson, Dak Prescott. So it sounds like Dak, you shouldn't be fading him from QB5. So I think there's a little bit of a gap between 5 and 6. Not a huge gap, but again, I think it sounds like it'd be worth taking him even with the rushing concerns. The next guy, Matt, I think I called you Matthew, and I got roasted for it last time just because you have Matthew Betts in your profile.
That's what I go by all the time, so that's fine with
me. But we're friends. I think at this point, if I'm having you on the show, I think we like each other enough to be able to do a second show together. But I will say that with this next player, our friendship is going to be tested a little bit. I wouldn't call it a relationship and stuff like that, where you're going to break my heart, but like I could feel really sad after this conversation because DeAndre Swift is my highest owned player in redraft this year. I feel like I'm seeing something that not a lot of other people are seeing. I've heard a lot of smart people make really good cases about him on Twitter. And by everything I've seen, to put it simply, because people are tired of hearing me talk about DeAndre Swift in my podcast, if he doesn't produce this year and he stays healthy the whole year, he is going to be a historical outlier for not being really, really, really good. But obviously, groin injuries and stuff like that are never good. Doesn't sound like a thing from everything I've read that's good. But the thing is, I think even with how they've talked about the injury, how they dealt with it, I'm not an injury expert. I'm just giving my perspective here is, again, obviously the groin injury was concerning, but they sat him out of practice for 2 or 3 weeks until from what I read, they felt like he was fully ready to go and they gave him enough time to rest. But of course, you always worry about them rushing it back. But here's the thing that I'm seeing from my perspective that you could also correct me on is they're saying, okay, he is, concerned for week one and maybe he won't play week one. But it seems like from the quotes that I'm reading is people are making it out to be because of the groin injury. But I'm just hearing he's not in game shape. Now he has like 2 weeks to get in game shape. They've been saying that last week. So he has 3 weeks to get in game shape, and that was their concern. But my question to you, obviously the groin injury, what are the chances that it reoccurs? And by how they've handled it, is there less of a chance that it reoccurs and how everything they've dealt with it? So what have you gathered from the situation? Enough of me rambling about how much I love him and how I'm going to be upset if you give me the wrong take.
Yeah, DeAndre Swift actually, before we even kind of have the like week one talk, is a player who has a relevant history of previous groin injuries in his past in college. And so when I saw the injury in training camp, I was like, all right, this is a yellow flag. It's not a red flag, but it's worth noting. And so whenever a player has that in their history, you just want to be mindful that, again, that increases the volatility of a player. It's not like someone who randomly out of nowhere, like, this is my first hamstring injury. We're more confident that they're going to recover fully quickly and be fine, sort of thing, versus, Will Fuller is like the classic example for hamstring injuries where like you just knew like, here we go again. So I don't want this to turn into that sort of situation for DeAndre Swift. Otherwise, it will definitely change the outlook. So as far as how he's doing now, I think he's progressing as he should be. And there is a lot that happens where people see one quote or they see one report and they just kind of latch onto it. And I think that people are being misguided by that quote of, I'm concerned about him in week one. I think it was from Dan Campbell, but a report on The Athletic came out on August 25th. And the first half of the article about the section with DeAndre Swift is talking about how good he has looked, how good his jump cut has looked, him catching 2 touchdown passes that day, like positive things that if you just heard the quote, you'd be like, oh, well, DeAndre Swift, like we're done. And so I think that we need to have a conversation of what is his early season outlook relative to the what they've said about him. And I do think there's validity to the fact that he's probably not in the best shape that he could be if he didn't have this injury. I think that's very obvious to a lot of people. If you miss practice time, if you're rehabbing, you're not on the field doing everything you can be to get yourself ready for the game. So yes, I do think his early season outlook could be a little slow. Am I changing the way I'm viewing him from a season-long outlook right now? Not necessarily. That said, whatever the rushing prop is for DeAndre Swift in week one against the Niners, I'll be taking the under. Absolutely. I do think it's a little bit of a situation where you could see a slow start for DeAndre Swift.
Fair. Well, that hearing all that makes me very happy. You have headphones on, so I know you're married and stuff like that, but I love you for being able to say that. It gives me some confidence in DeAndre Swift. Keep the earbuds on. I don't need her saying that you can't do a podcast with me ever again, but I love to hear that because I feel like that's what I've been seeing. And there's all these people like my dad I'm pretty smart with fantasy. We have a team that we do together. And he's like, well, DeAndre Swift, like he might not play week one. I'm like, Dad, like read the quote, man. He just caught 2 touchdowns and they're just like, we're not sure if he's in game shape. And it's like 20 days before the season. Like, come on. But again, we'll stop talking about DeAndre Swift. People are probably so sick and tired of me. But I will say one thing real quick for the listeners. That is the last time I get to talk about Swift until the season starts. Finishing up this episode, probably no more Swift. I have one more episode with Matt Harmon that's strictly wide receivers. So unless Matt Harmon's flag plant is DeAndre Swift, then you will not hear me talk about him anymore.
Where do you have him ranked? I'm curious.
Where I have him ranked in half PPR, I have him ranked as RB14 right now.
All right, that's pretty fair. I think I'm a little bit lower. I think I have him at like 17 or 18.
Yeah, that's where most people have him. I think that's the consensus. I'm not going to get crazy with it, but again, I could give you the whole spiel and whole argument after. But it's pretty ridiculous what I think he's gonna do. But again, enough about Swift. Let's move on to someone less exciting like Kenny Golladay. Kenny Golladay, again, another player that we talked about a couple months ago with his hip issue. Didn't seem to be an issue. It seemed like he'd be fully okay, but now we got the Will Fuller special, the hamstring, and the hamstring has been something that's been bothering Kenny Golladay a bit in practice. We've heard some mixed reports of him just not being that great in general. We've heard reports about a hamstring injury. We talked about earlier how this might be one of the worst offenses in the league with the offensive line. So are you concerned about Kenny Galladay's hamstring and the soft tissue kind of injuries? And are you taking him in any leagues at this point from everything we've already talked about?
I have 0 Kenny Golladay this year, and I do not plan to change that strategy. I had a decent stance on that before the injury occurred, and it's mostly because of massive concerns with the offense, like we talked about. Daniel Jones, of course. And then, people kind of forget, like, we have this huge sample size of wide receivers changing teams, not necessarily being a great thing. And last year, of course, we had like Stephon Diggs come out and finish atop the wide receiver room. So it kind of was like, oh, like, let's throw that out the window. But that's still a factor working negatively for him. So there's a lot going on that I'm just not excited about with Kenny Galladay. And then you add in the injury history, right? So now we have another soft tissue injury on top of his already lengthy injury history as far as those are concerned. And it's just a player where if he was in a better offense, that we were really confident in his quarterback, I'd be like, yeah, I'm willing to take on that risk of those soft tissue injuries. But yeah, for Kenny Galladay at this point, I think I'm out for all those reasons.
Same here. I have 0 shares of Kenny Galladay in best ball, redraft, dynasty for my one dynasty league. Kenny Galladay is a guy that I'm not interested. I don't hope he's bad for that sake. Like, I hope Kenny Galladay, sets the receiving yard and receiving yard. I mean, he sets the record in receiving yards, and Daniel Jones becomes the greatest quarterback of all time. As entertaining as that would be, I just don't see it happening, unfortunately. But that's enough about Kenny Galladay. One injury that besides Swift, was one of the ones that I'm really very interested to get into is Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I feel like people aren't talking about that enough. I know it seems like he's going to play week 1. He's been practicing, and he had an ankle sprain, and there was the whole like inside ankle sprain drama about like what that could turn into. So with the time that he has to recover before week 1, and obviously what that sprain is, what is your concern that he re-sprains that ankle early in the season? Obviously, he got hurt last year, and I know it doesn't. Again, we know that just because someone gets hurt one year doesn't mean they're going to automatically get hurt the next year. But the fact that he got hurt late last year, and then we see him get hurt early in preseason this year, do you have any concerns about his ability to handle a workload? And what are the concerns about his ankle itself and the chance of re-injury?
Yeah, I'm not too concerned about Clyde Edwards-Helaire at this point, looking towards week 1. The injury by all accounts is pretty minor, and I know that people kind of heard that like inside of the ankle is a concern, and people were already throwing out comps of Michael Thomas, and it was never close to that. I mean, you have to be really careful with what you hear out there. Michael Thomas had a pretty significant high ankle sprain. Of course, we know the story by now with his issues with surgery and all that stuff that we'll get to in a minute, but it was never that severe. It's minor. I do think with about 3 to 4 weeks of rest, recovery, rehab, he's going to be fine. So entering week 1, is he going to play? Yes, I feel confident about that. Is he going to get maybe what his normal workload would be if he didn't have this injury? Maybe not. Maybe it's a few more touches, but I'm not necessarily changing the way that I view him as far as the season-long outlook at this point.
Okay, that's good to hear. I've been avoiding him a little bit just because I wasn't sure. And, I was fine taking your Chris Carsons and guys like that in that type of range. But again, that definitely gives me a little bit more confidence in Swift. Another guy, like you said, in a minute, you toss me a little lob and I'll give it right back to you. Is Michael Thomas. Obviously, the ankle injury today, he was placed on the PUP list, which means he's going to miss at least the first 5 or 6 games of the season. But, again, you might say that for some people I heard that, okay, well, this is a good thing for him, that they're not rushing him back and stuff like that. So with the timeline that he's had since, I think it was late June, is when he had the surgery until week 6 or 7 of the season when he's going to be playing again. How confident are you that Michael Thomas is going to be able to return to form quickly? And do you expect some rust to be there when he gets back on the field based off his ankle injury history at this point?
Yeah, it's been a long time since we've seen Michael Thomas be Michael Thomas, and I think that's a huge factor in this entire conversation. Remember, the injury happened week 1 last year. He tried to come back and play through it, and then they shut him down. And obviously by now we know that maybe they want him to have surgery. Maybe he didn't. We don't really know the details behind the scene, but his surgical timeline really does put his early to mid-season outlook in a pretty negative spot. Of course, he's going to miss 6 games. So it's like, yeah, bets, of course, this is not good. We want our players to be on the field. But when he comes back from that injury, we're also need to remind ourselves he's never caught a pass from Jameis Winston. Or if it's going to be Taysom Hill, of course, he played a little bit with him at that point. But however that quarterback situation shakes out, that's also new. And now you have a player coming back from injury that hasn't really seen game action in over a year. So I'm pretty out on Michael Thomas unless you have an IR spot. Like, I'm not taking him to be like, oh, this is super sneaky, I'm gonna play him in week 7. Like, I'm not having that outlook. If he gets dropped, sure, maybe I'll pick him up. If I have an IR spot and he falls, sure, I'll take him and stash him. But I'm not expecting much from Michael Thomas until we get to like late October, honestly.
Okay, that's good to know. Well, that right there, that kind of analysis about Michael Thomas. If anyone listening is wondering, like, Oh, how did this guy get with the fantasy footballers? That's it right there. Just that absolutely expert analysis that you get right there. Absolutely love it. But we have two more players to get into. The tight ends. The first one, Irv Smith. Obviously, this injury seems a little bit more mysterious with the meniscus tear, or the meniscus surgery, rather. I don't know if tear is the right word here. But obviously, meniscus and injury and tight end that people want to be good for fantasy football is never a good combination. So I don't know if you can speak better to the timeline of what this probably is based off the information you heard. And the other thing is, again, similar to Michael Thomas and every other guy that we've talked about, because this is fantasy football, when you get back on the field from something like a meniscus injury at whatever point that is, how concerning is it that he's going to be able to perform early on? Because again, if he's not performing in the first 2 or 3 weeks back from this injury, people are going to be dropping him and he's going to end up on the waiver wire. So what is your confidence level in Irv Smith and coming back healthy? And can you speak to the timeline at all?
Yeah, I personally am not drafting Irv Smith with this news. And it's if you're drafting, let's say, today's August 31st. If you're drafting today, tomorrow, this weekend, hopefully we get the news of like what exactly is going on with his injury, because as of right now, we don't know. And what I mean by that is that we know he has a meniscus injury, but they haven't revealed to us how severe it is. And basically, sometimes it shows on the MRI that yes, you do have a meniscus injury, but when you go in to evaluate the joint, when surgeons go in to do the surgery, sometimes they see more damage than they actually thought, or sometimes less. So they might change like mid surgery, like, oh, we were planning to go in and just take out this little piece, but actually the tear is pretty big. We should repair it. So we don't really know what it's going to be. But here's the two ranges of outcomes. If they do go into the knee joint, see that it's a little tear, and they just take out that tiny piece, that's pretty straightforward. It's about a 4 to 6 week recovery. And so you could say, all right, Irv Smith might be back for week 3, 4, 5, something like that. But if it's a situation where they have to go and actually repair the entire meniscus, that is a season ending injury. So the range of outcomes here are pretty massive. And so for that reason, combined with like, he's already kind of that late round tight end where we know the hit rate isn't great. Like, I'm just not taking Irv Smith right now. He's a player to look for if we do get positive news from the surgery on your waiver wire. But outside of that, not interested in Irv Smith right now.
Yeah, no, me either. I wasn't really that interested in him anyway, just because, again, low volume passing offense. He's playing with two really, really, really great wide receivers, and Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson. Obviously, Dalvin Cook is there taking work. So I wasn't that interested in Irv Smith anyway, because, like, what's the ceiling when you're probably the fourth option or maybe third option target-wise at best? Unless you have like a Robert Tonyan 11 touchdown season, but you're never going to bet on that. But again, you're never going to bet on that. Haha, had to throw it in there.
There you go.
But I had to sneak it in and take it when the opportunity arises. But there's one player left today that we have to talk about. That's Evan Engram. Evan Ingram's actually a guy that one of the later round tight ends because of his athletic profile that's a lot better than people realize. Like one of the stats I saw on Twitter the other day that Evan Engram had 1 touchdown last year on over 100 targets. And if he just had 3 touchdowns on 100 targets, which is not a lot to ask, he would have been the tight end 8 in fantasy. And I know last year was a weird year for tight ends when like Robert Tonyan and Logan Thomas are like at the top of the tight end leaderboard. So if you want to make that argument, fine. But again, 2 more touchdowns on over 100 targets when he only had 1 touchdown, he would have been the tight end 8. That's pretty interesting. And I know this offense is a little bit more crowded with Saquon back and Kenny Golladay, but the point being, Evan Engram, someone I'm interested at tight end, especially in the later rounds, but he's had some injury problems in his career. Last year was the first year that he played all 16 games. And then the last preseason game, week 3, he came up with a calf injury. So with calf injuries, I know people usually it's hamstring injuries that people always talk about that are concerned about, but are calf injuries very concerning for their reoccurrence? And how quickly should he be able to get back on the field with something like that with the information that you have?
Yeah, I'm getting pretty bad vibes about Evan Engram right now, honestly. It's the calf injury then in and of itself can be like a hamstring injury where it's kind of tricky and easy to aggravate. But the issue is like most times, unless it's like right after the injury, walking around up and down stairs, that kind of day-to-day stuff, totally normal. Like you feel fine. And then you go to like test it and sprint, and all of a sudden, like that's when you need your calf to push off with a lot of force, and you can really easily aggravate it. So when I'm seeing patients with this injury and trying to be like educating them, like, hey, listen, I know you're feeling good, but we need to continue to pull back the reins here and make sure that we don't push it too fast. So it's not looking good for his week 1 availability. It's also not looking good for the first month of the season, maybe. I mean, there's news as of yesterday from Jordan Raanan from ESPN that he's going to get a second opinion to meet with another doctor on this. And typically with the calf strain, you can evaluate it on an MRI with the team. They'll see it and they'll say, okay, here's what we're going to do. So anytime that like second opinion type of thing is happening with a muscle injury, it doesn't give me good vibes. I really could see a scenario where Evan Ingram misses a decent chunk of the early part of the season.
Ooh, that's a tough blow. But again, I don't feel as strong about that one. So we're still friends. You don't have to worry about our relationship. I know you were concerned about it. I just figured I'd give you the clarification just in case. But that is it for the 10 players. The last question, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. And if you don't have anything, like totally fine. I just figured I'd ask. We talked about 10 different guys today, but just quickly, are there any other players that we didn't talk about that come to your mind that in your head right now, you're like, Alex, like you're an idiot. We should have talked about this guy. Is there anyone else that comes to mind that you're concerned about or more optimistic about that like people should hear about a little bit or think about come draft time?
That's a good question. Let me think about it for a second here. I can kind of pull up I'm going to pull up the injury report from the UDK and we'll kind of chat through it. Yeah. I guess one that I definitely want to talk about real quick is T.Y. Hilton.
Okay.
This situation could turn really ugly really quick for him as far as his outlook. We know it's a disc injury in his neck and upper back. Those can be, they're not quick to go away and recover if they're severe enough to affect your performance and your ability to play football. So we know he's going to miss time. They've already come out and said he's going to miss multiple regular season games. They didn't really say when or how much. And that really doesn't sound great, especially for a player that already has concerns about. He's 31. Carson Wentz, who knows if he's actually a good quarterback anymore, like literally was objectively the worst quarterback in football last year. So now he has a new quarterback. There's a lot going wrong for T.Y. Hilton. So he's a player that I'm definitely very concerned about as far as his outlook this year.
Okay. Good to know. That's great. That's why I asked you, great staying with that. It's a tough, put you on the spot a little bit, just testing you, keeping on your toes, whatever, helping you out when you get on a podcast with the Ballers, I guess. So obviously right now I view myself as a miracle worker, but that's okay. It's just my opinion. Obviously, obviously I'm kidding people if you don't hear my sarcasm, but that is it for the show. Matt, thank you so much for coming back on the show. It was an absolute pleasure to have you. That helped me a lot. I learned a lot in this podcast. DeAndre Swift is going to be okay. Maybe not, but no, really good discussion about injuries and stuff like that. And I really appreciate you coming on. Do you have any final thoughts or things that you want to plug for the listeners?
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. It was fun to be on again. And like I said, these shows where you get to come back as a guest a second time, it tells you that you weren't a complete idiot the first time. So I appreciate it. Thanks a lot for having me. As far as what I've got going on, for me, DFS season is right around the corner. So in addition to all the injury stuff that I do with the Ballers, I host the DFS podcast. I contribute primarily to the DFS Pass. So anyone that bought the Ultimate Draft Kit Plus, you're going to find a lot of my work in there for DFS. I'm excited. I've had a new passion with DFS this last year. Absolutely love it. I still love redraft leagues, but DFS, there's nothing better than that Sunday sweat of if you're going to win money or not. So come check out the DFS podcast.
I love it. Definitely go check it out. Again, like you said, you're one of the lead writers, podcast, stuff like that. I actually have listened to the podcast since I had you on, and I really like it. I'm more excited for DFS and stuff like that every day. I'm starting to get more into it, and that is also thanks to you. So I love what you do. I love what you're doing, and you talk about more than just injuries. Very helpful for DFS, and I'm excited, hopefully, for you to help me sweat out some Sundays and hopefully win some money. Nonetheless, I'm excited about it, and I will definitely be listening or continuing to listen, rather, during the season. But thank you so much for everyone listening to the Fresh Fantasy Podcast today. It's been a pleasure being with you listeners. You're the ones that make it possible. You guys are the reason that I do this, and I love getting to put out episodes like this with great guests like Matt for you guys. But the best way that you can help me is leave me a little feedback. When I love it, hate it, don't matter to me. I need to hear it all because that's the only way that you can get better. You guys hear me say it over and over, but it's like practice, whatever it is. I want to know what I did wrong or what I can do better, because we want to make this the best podcast that can possibly be, especially if you're tuning in. So with that being said, please leave a review. You guys already know what to do, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.